Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that is teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Robert Blumofe, and he oversees areas like edge computing, zero trust, and 5G while working closely with customers and internal leaders on digital transformation. We'll explore how technical professionals can better communicate with non-technical audiences, why technical excellence alone is not enough to influence outcomes, and what organizations can do to close that gap. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Robert.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So, first question for you. When did you first realize that technical excellence alone was not enough to influence outcomes?
Wow, actually, I think fairly early on, probably, mostly through failure. Um, because you get into an environment, one of the great things about the corporate environment is that it's a collective endeavor, it's a collective enterprise. And, to get anything done in that environment, you're bringing into play so many different points of view, so many different skill sets. It's such a diverse organization in terms of skill sets, responsibilities, and things like that. And that's kind of the great thing about the enterprise is you get something, you're able to do something larger than what any individual can do because you're bringing together so many different things. But to do that, it does mean you have to start communicating beyond the small cadre of people who share your background, who share your knowledge, who share your metaphors, your language, and things like that. Before joining Akamai, I was largely in an academic setting, and I can remember in the early days giving academic talks. I'd be at a conference like the Fox, which is Foundations of Computer Science. So I'm giving a talk on algorithms, but I'm giving a talk to algorithmists. And that's communication is an important skill there as well, but you're able to anchor yourself with an audience that has by and large the same internal language, metaphors, and background knowledge. That changes when you get into the enterprise. And so I think it was, probably my early days at Akamai as I started having to work across all these different organizations, working with people that are just so vastly different, that I realized how important getting out of that comfort zone is, yeah, that communicating in that heterogeneous environment.
It's interesting you mentioned all that, Robert, because just yesterday I posted on LinkedIn the usefulness or how what we say as technical presenters should be the priority as opposed to nonverbal communication. Well, I do say that nonverbal is important, but when you were talking about having to present in front of other algorithmists, they probably are going to they're way more likely to overlook the fact that your hand is shaking if what you're saying is useful to them and they find it interesting. And that's what I responded to one of the commenters. He said that most communication is nonverbal, and so if you miss that, then your whole presentation isn't going to go over as well. But I my response was, especially if you're a technical person and your goal is to convince somebody that this is something, whatever you're talking about, is something to pursue, they're more than willing to overlook certain quirks you may have about your nonverbal communication if what you're saying is clear, relevant, and actionable. And I just get that sense because typically when people talk about speaking, they talk about the nonverbal, using your
Yeah.
hands and vocal variety and all those other things. But when you're a technical person, if what you're saying isn't clear to people, and all the hand movements aren't going to make much of a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in some ways it is a fairly forgiving audience. You are speaking by and large to peers, again, people who sort of share that background. And I think they are sufficiently motivated and interested in hearing what you have to say that they'll forgive a lot of things. They won't forgive, they won't forgive shoddy work. Maybe let's put it that way. So you do have to come in with a degree of confidence in the work that you're presenting. Especially I remember in the backgrounds. When I was a graduate student at MIT, and you have people coming in to present at MIT. The MIT audience is pretty intense, and they are very willing to disagree. Not in a mean way, but in a very sort of in an attempt to reach the truth. And it can be a very challenging environment to present in and intimidating. But again, it's not because anybody is out there to be mean. It's because there really is such an almost aggressive pursuit of truth that yeah, people will challenge assumptions, question assumptions, and certainly if there's a flaw in your proof, they'll find it. That's a good thing, but it can be intimidating. So, I wanted to say that it's a forgiving audience, and in some ways it is. And for me, it was a great way to get started with public presentation, a great way to sort of learn how to present technical material. But yeah, but it's not always forgiving.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And when I think about that, I guess it all comes down to how you look at it. You could look at it as intimidating, but you could also look at it as helping you improve. Because
Yeah,
when you get that information, like just like you said, they're looking for the truth. It's not
yeah,
they're looking to trip you up, but I mean, if you
right.
did miss something that could potentially improve your research, wouldn't you want to know? As opposed to
Exactly.
people just say, "Oh, great job!" Like that doesn't help me if there's something that's glaringly that I'm missing with the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
It certainly it can come across as direct and come across as blunt, but if it comes across as true, I mean that should be what you should be concerned with, at least in my opinion.
I totally agree, and I think if you can go in with that attitude and welcome the critique, well, welcome the challenge, then you can learn a lot, and I certainly certainly learned a lot from that environment. Also, I had great teachers. I've talked a lot about the value that I got from working in that environment. My PhD advisor was Charles Lyserson at MIT, and some of your audience may have read. He's a co-author on the algorithms book that maybe a lot of people in the audience are familiar with, the Corman, Lyserson, Rivest, and Stein. And if you ever use that book, then you know that Charles and the other three authors are just spectacularly great communicators at technical material. They labor over every word, over every symbol to make sure that it's clearly defined, and that there's no gap in the assumptions being made by the reader versus the assumptions being made by the writer. And I had to learn that painstakingly. Writing with Charles, research papers and presentations it was torture because he cared about every single word, every single symbol, every single thing that went on a slide or in the document. And we had to go over in such minute detail. Is it absolutely clear, not just to us, but to the reader, given everything that we've said so far, what this symbol means or what this word means? And we took days, weeks, months just writing short documents. And it was truly painful, but boy, did I learn a lot from that exercise.
I'm sure you did, and thinking about it now, I would hope that other people would, like yourself, at least ultimately appreciate the rigor that person put you and
Yeah,
others through in really making sure that this is clear, not just to yourself, because you're not in the audience. You're not trying to convince somebody. Well, you are trying to convince somebody. You're not the one trying to be convinced. You're the one trying to do the convincing. So
yeah.
it can make perfect sense to you, but if it makes no sense to the people you're talking to, then what was the point? You should have just, sat at your desk.
Exactly. It's what's going on in the audience in their head that really matters. And um, I think there's a few lessons in this. One is that you have to really care. If you're giving a talk just because it's being required of you and you're presenting material that you don't care about, boy, that's a tough position to be in. It's really hard to do your best work in that environment. But if you have something that you really want to say and you're being given the opportunity to say it, that means that you really care about what your audience is hearing and their ability to understand it. And that means that you're going to be then willing to put in the time. And the bottom line is, I think there's just no substitute for just effort. Even after all these years, I talked about working with Charles, we worked together for years. I don't think it ever got easier. Even 7, 10 papers in, it was still just as hard to write. It just requires effort. You got to care and be willing to put in that effort. And part of that does mean being willing to think carefully about the position that your audience is in. Do they share the same word definitions? Do they share the same sort of mental images? Do they share the same metaphors? Probably not. And once you recognize that and you put yourself in their shoes, there's an empathy aspect. Understand your audience, empathize with your audience, and communicate to that audience in a way that sort of meets them where they are. That is not an easy thing to do. It just is hard work. And you just got to be willing to put it in. And presumably, if you care about what you're saying, well, then you're going to do that.
You know what would make it easier though, Robert, is if us technical people remember who we were when we weren't technical. Because you mentioned you were in academia for some time, but you weren't always an academic. You
Yeah,
didn't always have a PhD. You didn't always have a bachelor's. You didn't always have the background you
yeah.
had. What kind of presentation could you have understood before you were the expert you are? And I think a lot of us we forget who that person was. But if we were to remember that person's way closer to our non-technical audience than the person we are now.
Absolutely. I love that. That's a great way to say it. Is sort of, yeah, remember who you were. But there's also, an aspect of sort of so many different perspectives, and there is sort of a simple, sort of a crude cut of technical versus non-technical, but say even within technical there's such a diversity there, and people have such different ways of viewing things. I think that the kinds of images, metaphors, and language that's used by, say, a cybersecurity professional who maintains firewalls is going to be vastly different than somebody who, say, is working on file systems in an operating system. They're going to have very different language, very different meanings for the same words, very different structures and ways of thinking about things. So even technical, you still have the same challenge of empathizing with your audience and understanding that they may not share the same, language, metaphors, and things like that. And again, having to meet them where they are. So, yeah, even within technical, you have to slice much more fine grain than that. Yeah.
You're 100% correct. And I know you're 100% correct because I had a conversation with a previous guest and we touched on this explicitly. He said that when you're giving presentations in front of an audience and you may have another technical person in there, but they have a different technical background than you,
Right.
they are going to think that I should understand what this person is saying, but I don't because I have a different technical background. At least they're thinking that's what other people are thinking. It's like
Right.
you're technical too. How do you
Right.
not understand what this person is saying? But it's like, look, he's electrical and I'm in mechanical. Those are two totally different
Yeah.
realms. So yeah, we both have engineering degrees, I suppose, but those are two totally different things. So he's using a whole bunch of jargon. I have no clue what he's talking about, just like you do. But just you're absolutely right. Just because you both have technical backgrounds doesn't mean you automatically will understand what they're saying. So you
Yeah.
definitely have to keep that in mind, no matter who
Yeah.
you're talking to.
Yeah. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult to empathize that way and really recognize where you're making assumptions because of the language and metaphors that are in your head that may not be consistent to the person you're speaking to. It's a very, very difficult to do. For example, maybe you've written something and now you're proofreading it. Can you read it pretending that you're somebody else? Or if you just came up with a presentation, can you walk through that presentation pretending that you're not you, that you're an audience member who again doesn't share those that language, those metaphors and things like that. So boy, it's so hard to do. And I think you have to be willing to do it and take the time to do it. Yeah, and by the way, yeah, I've been thinking about this a fair bit since we put this on the calendar that I was gonna do this conversation with you. I started thinking a little bit more about what it meant, to sort of put yourself into the audience's shoes and understand their perspective. And I think some of it is this sort of high level concept of, do they share language and metaphors and things like that. But it occurred to me that another aspect of it is even down to the detail of understanding what are they doing, for example, in a talk, when you put up that slide, you put up a slide, what are they going to do at that moment? And I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about this, but until recently. But the modern presentation is a strange animal, right? Because you've got slides and you're speaking. So there's something that you expect your audience to read, whether it's text or whether it's a graph. They're supposed to read and decipher the graph, or maybe it's a diagram. They've got to read the diagram. They've got to figure out what the different symbols mean. These arrows, what do those arrows represent? And, the stuff in the left, is that different than the stuff on the right there? You have to read and decipher everything on the slide the same time you're speaking. So that's weird, right? Are we expecting the audience to listen or are we expecting the audience to read?
This
And
is excellent. This is excellent.
right,
it's so funny you mentioned all this, Robert, because I'm a big fan of when it comes to the slides, you minimize the amount of text on a slide, so you eliminate the ability for people to read so that they
yes,
actually listen. So either they're going to listen or they're going to ignore you. And then when it comes to other visuals, like when you mentioned the tables or charts, I also say you try to minimize the number of them you have on any given slide because you don't want people darting their eyes from slide to slide, wondering which slide this or what or from visual to visual, wondering which visual they're supposed to be looking at. So
yeah,
having as few of them on a slide as possible is great. But then also what I suggest is if you are to have that type of visual, give it a title that will convey what you want people to take away from that visual. So they
yeah.
don't have to think about it too hard. Okay, this graph is supposed to convey X. Say that in the title. So now they know why that graph is there.
Yeah, I mean, so you're exactly where I want to go with this. I mean, I just you're speaking my language. I so strongly agree, and that's a discipline that I learned, all the way back to Charles, for example, my PhD advisor. But it's so important. And the perspective that I've recently adopted, per what we were just saying, is I try and imagine what is the audience going to be doing when I put up this slide. If there's a bunch of text, to your point, they're going to be reading. And if they are reading, they're not listening to me. For all the talk about, I know kids these days think they can multitask. That's nonsense. If somebody's reading, they're not listening. If they're trying to decipher what that graph says, what's on the x-axis, what's on the y-axis, what those 7 lines mean, which one's red and the blue one, and if they're doing all that, they're not listening to you. So you have to make sure that what you're saying is aligned with the activity that they're engaged in right now. Um, and I think actually, when it comes to text, for example, people say, well, you shouldn't just read the text on the slide. But I would rather be reading the text on the slide than saying something different than what they're reading. Because at least if I'm reading the text, then there's no dissonance. I'm saying the same thing that they're reading. We're just reading together. Because maybe those words are just so important, and I've so carefully written those words. I want to just read those words. That's fine. At least there's no dissonance. Better is to just not have a lot of words on there on the slide itself. Whatever points you want to make, you can sort of structure it as just a handful of words that are kind of outlining the key points. So you've got an anchor, but you don't want them reading something that's different than what you're saying. You don't want them deciphering a graph while you're trying to say something else. Even diagrams, always I see these overly complicated diagrams with a dozen different symbols and a dozen different colors and it takes time to decipher a diagram like that, with the round things versus the square things and the green versus the orange. What do these different things mean? It takes time to decipher that. And when it comes right down to it, okay, well, what point are you trying to make? And 9 out of 10 times of those 12 things, you only needed 2 of them to make the point you wanted to make. So get rid of all that crap. The same thing is true, by the way, with graphs. People always make a graph that's got way more in it than what's needed to make the point you're trying to make. And people hate to throw out the other stuff. You say, look, the only point you were trying to make is this point. You only need this one thing. Throw out everything else. And they're like, oh, I don't want to do that. That's all interesting information. I'm like, fine, but that's not the point you're trying to make right here. People want to put the whole kitchen sink onto that graph because they've got it. And they're so proud of all the stuff that they've generated. They want to put it out on the graph and present everything. I'm like, you have to be ruthlessly throw out everything that's not relevant to the point on the slide. Keep just the minimum context and just every time you write a slide, think about what is your audience doing at the moment that slide goes up and make sure what you're saying isn't creating dissonance with what they're doing at that moment.
You're 100% correct, Robert. There's been so many instances in which I've been in the audience of a technical conference, and I'm looking at the slide. I'm seeing all these graphs with the various symbols and the various colors and all the text, and I'm thinking to myself, I could read just as well as this guy can read. So why am I here? You could have sent me this in an email. I could have read it at my leisure. And here I
Yeah,
am, seated in the audience, listening to you read. So we could read together. It's like I think we could do better. But I think in a lot of instances we don't really think about that. We think about our own comfort. We have a lot of text on the slide because we can read it and we are not going to forget anything because we're reading. And
yeah,
we were already nervous about giving this presentation in the first place. If at least we have the words there for us to read, maybe we're not going to be as nervous. But you know what also ends up happening is when you're reading, you're not looking at the audience. And if you're not looking at the audience, they're likely not looking at you. And if they're not looking at you, they're looking in other places. They're looking at their phones. They're
that's
looking
right.
at the other people. They're looking at their shoes. They're falling
Yeah.
asleep. They're doing a whole bunch of other things other than listening to you give the presentation.
Yeah, yeah, you look disengaged, and I agree. Yeah, that doesn't work very well. But I do think, the discipline, and it's a discipline of minimizing what's on the slide so that it's only what you absolutely need, and making sure that your speaking is consistent with, not dissonant with the whatever activity. You can almost think of each slide as like a task. Every time you put up a slide, you've given your audience a task. Here's some text. I want you to read it. Here's a graph. I want you to decipher it. Here's a diagram. I want you to decipher it. Each slide, you're almost giving the audience a task, and they're going to be engaged in that task. And so you better make sure that your words are not creating dissonance with the task that they're engaged in.
Absolutely. Robert, when I first started this YouTube channel and podcast, it was based on my own struggles giving presentations in front of management. I worked as a medical device engineer, and every month I had to give presentations in front of management. And those
Oh,
first few presentations were absolutely horrendous, Robert.
oh.
I didn't know it was possible to sweat that profusely, but there I was doing exactly that. And what would happen is I'd have to answer a bunch of questions afterwards that I thought I had answered during the presentation. But luckily, I got, I guess, the wake up call. My project got canceled. So that really gave me the wake up call that I needed to think that in communicating with others is something that I should get better at.
Yeah.
And I went about the task of doing that. But I did that on my own. The organization I worked for, they didn't really help me in making that happen. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what organizations can do to help technical people in improving their communication skills.
It's a great question, and obviously one is creating the opportunities for people to present, but also being willing to critique. We talked about when you're in front of an audience, and if somebody is challenging you, that's not to try and humiliate you necessarily. Well, maybe sometimes it is, but hopefully it's not. It's ultimately to get to truth. Now, in a learning context, you might not want to do that in front of the audience. If you're mentoring somebody, or if you're somebody's boss and you're trying to help them get better at presentation, you might not want to provide the critique during the talk. But absolutely, after the talk, that's an opportunity to provide feedback. And again, I was very lucky to get that. In early days, where not only during the creation of the presentation, where Charles would go through my slides and just say, wow, why do you have all this crap on there that's not needed to the point you're making? And again, just going through all that pain of helping me create the slides and learning from that. But then afterwards, the critique of what I did well and what I didn't do well. So yeah, you need the opportunity, and you need somebody who's willing to put in the effort. I mean, that's also real effort to critique and provide the feedback. None of that comes for free. All that is hard work.
100%. So for the people who are listening or watching our conversation, Robert, and they think getting better at communicating with non-technical people as a technical person is something I really want to do, what would you say is the number one thing they should do to get started on that journey?
Well, again, finding somebody, finding the opportunities to do presentations, and somebody you can work with who you think is good and can help you on that. Of course, there's probably good places you can go to hear good presentations. Um, yeah, I don't have specific recommendations there, but again, we are working especially if you're doing these sort of slide presentations, it's a peculiar medium. And I think finding people who have done a good job with that, and seeing examples, that certainly helps. But yeah, I don't know that I have any great suggestions besides just putting in the hard work of learning, and helping, finding the right people to teach you.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you could read all the books or watch all the YouTube videos, listen to all the podcasts, but you don't get better at these
Yeah,
things
yeah.
unless you get out there
It's
and
got to
do
be,
it. And then
yeah,
you
hands-on is critical.
yep, you get out there, you put in the reps, and then you get feedback and questions that I'm interested in getting after giving a presentation, especially a technical one. If you're speaking to non-technical people, is was that presentation understandable? Was it relevant? And was it actionable? Especially if you're speaking to decision makers, those
Yeah,
three questions are really important. You want to make sure that whatever you're saying, they understand because they don't understand. The answer is no. You also want to make sure that they're not thinking, why am I here? You're presenting me with a bunch of, just like you mentioned, a bunch of things on slides that I didn't really need to know, but you thought was super important, but it's not important to me in me making decisions. And then in terms of it being actionable, okay, now what? Now I know all this stuff. What do you want me to do about it? So you want to make that clear as well. So I think
yeah.
once you get answers to those questions, I think you're in good shape.
I agree. Yeah. So, understanding your audience and what they're trying to get out of it, is it purely educational or are you trying to get to the ability to make a decision? And usually there's an educational aspect in all of that. Because to get to a decision, you presumably need to create some degree of education that at least gives everybody a common framework, a common set of language and metaphors and things like that so that you can get to a good decision. And yeah, so understanding what the goal of the audience is obviously important. And by the way, it occurs to me as oftentimes I've seen sort of people fall into the trap of going into something that's really intended to be educational or to make a decision about a certain aspect, but you go in with sort of an agenda that's maybe not consistent with that. I've seen that, in, for example, cybersecurity presentations where oftentimes cybersecurity professionals are so oftentimes in that world. And I've even seen cases where the presentation is all about eliciting fear. You want your audience to understand how dangerous the world is so that they're going to invest more in cybersecurity. And I get why that's a reasonable goal, but going into a presentation with that as your goal to elicit fear, that's not going to produce a good result. So you need to understand what your goal is and not go in with an agenda that's inconsistent with what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I fully agree. This has been a great conversation, Robert. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
I am on LinkedIn. I try and post, on a fairly regular basis and try and keep up on the communication there. But I'm maybe not as active as I probably should be. But it is the one sort of social media platform that I am on and do engage on. So that would be the one to use.
Excellent. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Neil.